Hello and welcome to episode 634 of the People Behind the Science podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are excited to be rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Jill Pruetz, first published on February 8th of 2016. Listeners, if you haven't met Jill yet, she is an accomplished anthropologist and primatologist. She is known for her groundbreaking research on savanna-dwelling chimpanzees in the country of Senegal in West Africa. Jill's also an exceptional science communicator, and she has dedicated herself to a wide variety of education, conservation, and community-focused initiatives over the course of her career. And in our conversation, Jill walks us through how she found her way to a career in science, her experiences doing fieldwork in the African savanna, life outside of science, and more. So listeners, get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am delighted to introduce you all to Dr. Jill Pruetz. So, Jill, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm great, and thanks so much for having me.
Well, it is a pleasure to have you on the show with us today, and I'm looking forward to introducing you to our listeners and talking about your life and your work. So I'm going to start off by giving them just a little bit of background information here. For listeners, Jill is a professor of anthropology at Iowa State University, as well as a National Geographic Society emerging explorer. In addition, she is the founder of the nonprofit organization NeighborApe that she founded in 2008. Now, Jill received her bachelor's degree in anthropology from Texas State University and her PhD in anthropology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She then conducted postdoctoral research at Miami University before joining the faculty at Iowa State, where she is today. And listeners, Jill has been featured in many media venues here. Her and her excellent research have been featured by NPR, BBC, CBC, National Geographic, New Scientist magazine. She has been on the Today Show and many more. And listeners, Jill is here with us today to talk about her experiences in life and science. So Jill, today we want to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start off this conversation by talking about your life outside of science and how you spend your time?
One of my favorite things to do is my work, and so I love to be in the field with the chimpanzees that I study. I can't always be in Africa, but even when I'm not there, I love to spend my spare time outside. And so hiking is one of my very favorite things to do. If I'm indoors and not working, then I love to read. I have 3 large misbehaved dogs, and so I spend a lot of time with them. I do like to travel, but usually I link it up with work somehow, and I usually like to travel to tropical places. But really, I like being outside more than anything. So anything that takes me outdoors is really fun for me.
I like it. And I think the dogs are often a good excuse to get outdoors. You have to go take them for a walk, right?
Definitely, yes. Oh, yes.
Well, I am a dog person myself. So can you tell us a little bit about your 3 favorites?
Well, right now I have 3 rescue dogs, and I always say that I study behavior, I don't train behavior very well. And so I kind of have let them develop pretty bad habits, but they're all very lovable, sweet dogs. I don't know their backgrounds because they were rescue dogs. And yeah, they take up a lot of my time, which is great. They stay with my father when I'm in Africa, so they go down to Texas where I'm from, and they're not always keen on that because it's pretty hot. Mm-hmm. The rest of the time they're in Iowa, and I have amazing students that actually help me take care of them when I travel to give talks or something like that. I have a little army of students that come over and take turns taking care of them. So I think they're pretty spoiled dogs, actually.
Well, that sounds like a great opportunity for the students as well to enjoy some time with your dogs.
Yes, they do. They get a good fix of dogs because a lot of them can't bring their dogs with them when they come to graduate school. And so, yeah, they're free to borrow mine whenever they want.
I love it. Well, Jill, wonderful to get a window into your life outside of science, but I want to talk about your research next. We've alluded to some of the things that you study in our initial conversation here, but I want to talk about your work and what you're doing now and how you describe it to people who might not be familiar with science in your field.
I study chimpanzees, and I think most people understand what that entails to some degree because of the prominence of people like Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey who study gorillas. But to get a little more specific, I oftentimes introduce my work by explaining what an anthropologist is, because most people don't know what an anthropologist is and why an anthropologist would even study chimpanzees. I study chimpanzees first and foremost because I'm interested in them. I fell in love with them when I volunteered to work with them years ago, but I'm also interested in them as an anthropologist because they shed some light into species that are no longer with us. So species that are related to us that were moving around on two legs maybe 6 million years ago. So we use chimpanzees as a sort of a model. And that's one of the reasons that I study them as an anthropologist. But I find that people find my research pretty easy to understand. So it's always very enjoyable for me to give public talks. People ask great questions. And I'm pretty lucky about having people interested in my work and understanding pretty well what I do.
Absolutely. I think people feel that sort of immediate connection with research related to these non-human primates and apes because it's sort of, they're so much like us, but quite different as well.
Yes, definitely. I try to show videos in my talks and that sort of thing. And I think that people can immediately make that connection. And it's pretty easy to understand chimpanzee behavior on some levels because it is so similar to ours.
Definitely. Well, Jill, I look forward to chatting about your work as we go through our interview, but I want to talk a little bit about what motivates you right now. And I know there's so much to get done in the life of a scientist that it can be hard to balance everything sometimes. So I am a quote person. I love pulling little tidbits of inspiration wherever I go. So can you share with us today one of your favorite motivational or inspirational quotes that you've really found inspiring?
One of my favorite inspirational quotes is actually from a sports figure, although he modified it from someone else. Mike Ditka. I've always been a fan of Mike Ditka. I've always been a fan of sports. And the quote goes something like, success isn't permanent and failure isn't fatal. And I think that is a good quote to think about in one's career. I mean, you can't be bothered by setbacks and you can't rest on your laurels. And so I've always looked to that quote as a form of inspiration. So Mike Ditka is one of my favorite people also.
I like it. Well, I have never heard that quote before, but I'm going to have to adopt that one. I love this idea of failure not being fatal. I think a lot of us as scientists, we fear failure, and it's such a big part of the process of science that you really have to get comfortable with it. So we'll have to talk about those failures later in our interview, but I want to talk a little bit next about some of the people who might have inspired or encouraged you along your journey as a scientist. I think you get to work with so many phenomenal people. Jill, are there certain ones that stick out in your mind as people who really inspired you or people who may have served as role models or mentors?
I feel like I've had a lot of really good people to look up to, and some of the most important people to me have been, besides my parents and my family being really supportive, have been teachers at all different levels of school. But I had some wonderful university professors that encouraged me to do things I never thought I could do. I just didn't think I could do those things and wouldn't have gone on to graduate school. So I owe them a great deal. I've just been fortunate to study under some really great scientists as well. Then, of course, people like Jane Goodall and other prominent primatologists and some of my peers and definitely scientists younger than me. I do look to women quite a bit. I think that it is difficult for young girls oftentimes in the sciences, which is being recognized more. But there are many, many people that I get encouragement from, and actually my students quite a bit. I have a predominantly female group of students, although I do accept male students, but I usually get more females applying. I call that the Jane Goodall effect.
Yeah.
But I learn a lot from them, and I hope they learn from me too.
Absolutely. And I think Jane Goodall is one of these people that stands out in a lot of young scientists' minds when they're thinking about primatology specifically, but also just women in science. So fantastic example to draw inspiration from there. And now, can you tell us a little bit about where this interest in science began? Was there a particular memory that stands out in your mind as kind of the first time that you started thinking about science or science as a career?
My mom would always like to tell people that I won the 8th grade science award, which is true.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so maybe in junior high it started in terms of focus on science. But even before then, I had a great love for animals. As far back as I can remember, as far back as anybody can remember, I always had a love for animals. I just wasn't sure really how to put those two together until I went to college. Where I grew up, there were a few options if you were interested in working with animals, and so being a veterinarian or a rancher. I grew up in rural South Texas, but people didn't talk about being a primatologist or anything like that. It wasn't very practical, and so it really wasn't until I got to college that I started going down the track that I ended up taking. But I always had a love for animals, and I can remember, I think we had Disney World encyclopedias or something that were all about animals. And I had my favorite encyclopedias and different things like that. But I think it was first animals and then science.
So were you particularly drawn to primates and apes as a kid, or were there other animals that you were considering as well?
Oh, horses were my big love, and I still do love horses. But I do remember one of my favorite entries in one of these encyclopedias was about spider monkeys. And I have students that have studied spider monkeys since then. I never embarked on a long-term study of spider monkeys. I've done some studies of them, but I wasn't set on primates. I really was set on horses for a long time. And then still, hopefully one day I will get a horse, but I can't quite swing it these days with travel.
So if you were going to get a horse, is there a particular type of horse that you have in mind?
Well, I don't think it's a breed. It's a color, as a Palomino, and being from Texas, quarter horses are usually the ones. But yeah, it would probably be something like a quarter horse, just a trail horse, nothing fancy.
Gotcha. Well, wonderful to hear about your journey towards science and kind of what got you started on this path. And I think a love of animals really attracts a lot of people to science, or love of nature, these sorts of things. But you're absolutely right. A lot of people don't really understand early on how to connect that with a career. So was there anything in particular that really helped open your eyes to how you could make this a career? Or was it just kind of seeing professors in college?
Really, for me, it was taking classes that opened up a whole new world for me. So I was an elementary education major, and I think it's much more difficult to teach high school, junior high, elementary aged kids. And that's where I started. I've always been interested in teaching, and I used to force my little brother to play school with me. But I took anthropology classes in college, and that's how I ended up changing my major and becoming an anthropologist. I was very interested in archaeology for a while, but I really owe it to these professors. And then I sat down with them and talked to them about job opportunities. And anthropologists are always a little bit, or at least maybe parents of students that want to declare anthropology as a major, maybe a little wary of job opportunities. But there are a lot of opportunities for anthropologists, and I think we should probably embrace the field even more so these days. But yeah, I really owe it to the college professors at Texas State where I went to school.
Well, now we've gotten to the point where you are an excited college student. You've switched over to anthropology. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the steps that happened next to get you where you are today?
I always tell students that I think experience is key. Once I knew what I wanted to do, I took all the classes and I loved the classes. I took a field school, and that is something I think is incredibly valuable for especially anthropology students and other students as well, biology, if you're interested in being a field scientist. And it can be a little costly, but there are ways. You have crowdfunding sources these days that we didn't have way back then, but really experience of some sort. And oftentimes you do have to volunteer or even pay for those volunteer experiences, but it really has a snowball effect. I think that is what helped me as much as my training and classes I took, because I was able to get hands-on experience. So I volunteered to work with chimpanzees. I had done field work with archaeologists, and so I was then selected to manage a primatology project in Peru, and that experience led me to be selected to run a project in Kenya for a couple of years. So it really is important to get some sort of experience as well.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with you there. I think being proactive and seeking out these experiences, particularly in the early stages of your career, is so important, whether you're in field science or trying to get work in a laboratory, things like that. Just kind of knowing what you're getting into, making those connections is critical. So then can you tell us a little bit about what brought you to Iowa State?
Well, when I got my PhD, I was lucky enough to get a postdoc. Then I began looking for jobs. So I started the research project that I have ongoing now with chimpanzees while I was a postdoc. It was always my dream. That's what I wanted to do. So I started that, and then I started looking for jobs. And for primatologists at that time, and probably still today, there might be a few more jobs, but there were only about, I think, 3 jobs specific to primatologists that are also anthropologists in the nation at that time. In fact, I can't even remember what those jobs were. I'm sure I applied for them, but Iowa State was actually a broader position, and it was for a biological anthropologist. So technically, I'm a biological anthropologist who studies primates. And so I interviewed for this job, and actually many people were surprised that I got it. Not anything against me, but oftentimes you're likely to hire a paleoanthropologist if you don't have any other biological anthropologists. And so for a while, I was the only biological primatologist here at Iowa State, and I have to say that I owe them a huge amount because they invested a lot in me. People think of Iowa State as the ag school, at least in Iowa they do. So sometimes I get funny questions like, why are you at Iowa State if you study chimpanzees? And we do a lot at Iowa State, a lot of different things. And they've always been really, really supportive of my work. And I considered myself very lucky to find a job during, basically, it was the first round of job applications that I applied for then. And it was a tenure track position, which is pretty rare to go straight into a tenure track position in anthropology these days from a postdoc.
Well, congratulations on getting that position. It sounds like it is a perfect fit and a supportive environment to be working in. So can you give us some details now about one of these projects that you have ongoing in the lab that you are just the most excited about?
Well, my lab is really in the field in Senegal, and my project started in 2001, so we're coming up almost on 15 years of the Fongoli Savannah Chimpanzee Project. And I have various avenues of direction, I guess I should say. And what's exciting to me is the chimps are the ones that basically decide where we're going with the research, because I went out and I still have broad interest in behavioral ecology, like feeding behavior and ranging behavior. And we do collect those data at all times. So we have a baseline data collection that allows me to compare over the past almost 15 years, the exact type of data collection. But then we have more specific types of projects that are geared towards basically what the chimpanzees do at my site that is different from other sites. So that was why I established the site, because I thought that chimpanzees in Senegal, where I work, would show some significant differences because they live in a savanna, not a forest, like all other chimps that are habituated to human presence live in. And so really the chimps have kind of led me in a number of different ways that I didn't anticipate. So right now we're looking at, for example, hunting and meat sharing, which I'm very interested in, but I didn't set out to study that.
Well, this is fascinating. I think it's so cool to hear about how you're able to spend a lot of your time conducting your research out in the field. And I'm interested to hear about, is there a particular thing that you can remember that was just the coolest or most surprising behavior that you saw from a chimpanzee while you were out in the field?
There's always something that every year makes my day, makes my week, makes my year. One of the most amazing things that happened to me, I guess it didn't start out as a very positive story, but it has a good ending. So what happened was some poachers just happened to cross the chimps, and they were able to capture a baby for the pet trade, but my project manager was able to confiscate her, and I flew back to Senegal, and we were able to give her back to her mother within 5 days. It was literally a miraculous turn of events. The mother was injured by these dogs that the people had, and it was really a fluke. They don't hunt chimpanzees purposefully, but I had heard that if something like this happens, people might take advantage of the situation to try and sell a baby. But I myself carried the baby back with my field assistants. We put her on the ground, and the chimps came up and got her, and a male carried her back to her mom, and then we observed them for the next 3 months. And that was one of the probably the best things that ever happened to me, because I really didn't think that we were able to get that baby back with her mom for a variety of reasons. So that was a completely unexpected turn of events, but that's the kind of thing that I think really appeals to me about the work. It was very difficult, but it was probably the most rewarding thing I've ever done.
Well, Jill, that is an awesome story. I feel like you could write a book about that or make a movie out of it. And I'm interested to hear more about Senegal. What is particular about this place or the chimps that are there that attracted you there?
The site in Senegal is a very different site. So all the chimps that have been studied over the long term live in forested environments. And we've known for a long time that chimps live in savannas, like in Senegal, but they are very difficult to habituate, which means just getting them used to people, to observers, so then you can follow them all day long and take data on their behavior. And we were able to do this after a period of 4 years. And there are some other projects that are close to this point now as well. But the key is the environment. And so not only just the nature of the vegetation, you don't have a forest, you have woodlands. So there are trees, but the trees lose their leaves for most of the year. The temperatures are incredibly hot. So during the peak of the dry season, it'll be between 110 and 115 degrees. And water is the key resource. Whereas at some sites, chimps don't even drink because they get enough water from their food. But chimps at Fongoli, for example, have to find water sources. They have to drink every day. And so these types of stresses really affect their behavior. And that's what I focus on. And that's why I chose the site. I knew I'd see differences, but I couldn't predict the types of differences that I'd see.
Well, so cool to hear more about your work. And I think, Jill, so far we have portrayed it as a grand adventure in science. And I think there are so many exciting days, so many ups in the career of a scientist. But I think there's a lot of down days too. And I think people don't hear so much about these because often you do hear about the success stories in the news, in the literature, but you don't hear about everything that came before it, all the struggle and turmoil. So, Jill, can you take us back to a memory of your own where you were really struggling with something, or maybe you had a major failure, and tell us what happened and how you worked through it to go on to be a successful scientist?
There are a lot of difficulties. And if you don't focus on the good things, I think it makes it even more difficult. And I have maybe not the greatest sort of propensity not to give up. And so there are probably times where maybe I should have given up for all practical intents and purposes, but I didn't. So perseverance, I think, for me has been key. But just trying to get the chimps habituated and trying to get funding to habituate chimps. So when you apply to a granting organization and you say it's going to take years and years and years just to get chimps habituated, but until then I can collect these types of data. That's fairly attractive, but it's not as attractive as promising data collection on this type of behavior and this sort of amazing thing we might see. So I wrote a lot of proposals when I first started. And I still write a lot of proposals, but I was really lucky in having National Geographic Society funded me a lot. They still continue to fund me. Iowa State funded me a lot. And we usually call those seed grants. So they enable you to do some work and then to get more funding from other organizations. But it was quite a struggle. And then on another level, and that's probably more difficult for me than the physical aspect of the work is also very difficult, but I relish that maybe even more. And so it is a very difficult site to work in. The heat oftentimes gets to people. I'm from South Texas, so I'm used to some degree of heat.
Gotcha.
But also it's an area that is fairly impoverished and medical care, for example, is lacking. And you do get sick and some serious illnesses occur there. So malaria, I get malaria about every year. There's other illnesses as well. And it's just a difficult place to be sick. And then if you're far from home, sometimes that can be quite stressful. Not so much for me anymore, but I know for students that come out, if they haven't had that much experience, it is a little stressful. But the chimps make it worth it. And so I think that really kind of overrides everything.
Gotcha. Well, now you mentioned this habituation period as being kind of a long, drawn out process. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do? I mean, in my mind, I'm just imagining you sort of creeping forward inch by inch and then waiting. Is this what happens?
Well, you actually have to be pretty overt and showing yourself to the chimps. And so that's where habituation efforts have failed in some cases because they were trying to kind of hide themselves. Mm-hmm. And the chimps see that, I believe, as a sort of predator type behavior, sneaking up on them. And
you're hunting them. Yeah.
Yes. And so you kind of reinforce this fear that they might have. And even though people in Senegal don't hunt the chimps, except in rare cases like I described, they do have conflicts with them and they are afraid of people, which is great. That's how we want them to stay. So they're habituated to just my small team and myself. And then if someone comes out with us, they're okay with those people, but they're not habituated to other people. But it just entailed trying to find them. And that was probably more difficult than anything. It's just trying to find them because they have a much, much bigger territory than chimpanzees do in forests. The key for us was finding a water source that they drank at during the dry season. And so we wouldn't sit right by the water source because that would have blocked them, but we sat some distance to where they could see us and they just waited. So they became habituated to us at that water source. They would come drink and then watch us and sometimes rest just above the water, but then actually following them, that was a whole nother animal. And so it did take years, and it was, especially at that time, I had to be on campus a lot more, and I relied on a number of students from a number of different universities, and then I've always had a great Senegalese team. But you couldn't let up. I couldn't have just done it while I was there and then come back to the States and then started over again, because it would have been like starting from point zero. Right. But apes are notoriously difficult to habituate. Some monkeys, like baboons, are really easy to habituate for a variety of reasons.
Well, Jill, thank you so much for sharing some of these challenges with us today. I think it's so important to talk about these so people can really get an appreciation for what goes on behind the scenes, behind these successes that they see in science. But I want to talk about your successes next, Jill. So can you share with us one of these really happy moments in science, one of these either big successes or just a small victory that really meant a lot to you?
I guess one of the biggest reports that have come out of the site is that chimpanzees at Fongoli, that's my study site, they hunt with tools. So they hunt this adorable little primate. It's a nocturnal primate that is quite small and it's active at night. So during the day, it tries to sleep in tree cavities like hollow branches and that sort of thing. And the chimps at Fongoli make these stick tools and they stab down into the cavities to get at the bush babies. And that was something that was seen only one time ever in all the decades of research on chimps. It was only seen once in Tanzania, but at my site, they do it regularly, and it's a seasonal activity. We see it at least 30 or 40 times a year, and I know we're missing quite a few bouts as well. And so that was probably the most publicized discovery. And not only do they hunt with tools, it's the females that are hunting more than males. And so that, again, was something that is outside of the norm of chimp behavior. So in other chimps, males hunt and they run down monkeys, and females don't hunt as much. And so that has really been a major focus for me since we first observed that. And really, there have been, though, a number of, in terms of the publicity garnered, there have been other findings, and some of them seem pretty mundane, like the fact that chimps soak in water at my site might seem pretty common sense to humans because we do that when it's hot, but it's something that chimps don't normally do. They don't really like water, but in a place where it's 115 degrees, you can expect that soaking in water would make sense. So there are a number of different findings, but really the hunting with tools and the fact that females do this hunting has been probably the most interesting finding. It's something that I've really embraced and focus on a lot these days.
Well, Jill, I think this is really cool. And I'm going back to this tools and hunting idea. Are there any hints at specialization? So do you see certain chimps who are maybe better at making a certain type of tool or better at using a tool, or they're sort of the tool maker versus the actual hunter?
It's interesting, and I hope now we've got several hundred cases. One of the things I want to look at is we do have successful females. So there's some females that are more successful than others. Tumbo, for example, is a very successful female. Farafa is a very successful female. And what I want to look at is how their hunting behavior is. So are they as expert as their mom? That's something that we're in the process of looking at. It's just that chimps are so long-lived, not that different from humans, in fact, that you need years and years of research. But it's interesting because even kid chimps, as young as 2 years of age, will start exhibiting this behavior. And they go through the steps really well. So they'll go through one of 4 to 5 steps in making a tool. But what they end up with is a tiny baby-sized tool that is very ineffective. And so it's so interesting that they don't just break off a big tool. They actually mimic these steps and then make a perfect twig-sized tool. But when they get to the age of about 4, we see that they become effective tool makers. The youngest that's been successful, though, I believe has been 6 years of age. And so there's different ages that are more or less successful. But then individuals, like I said, Tumbo and Farafa are very successful individuals. There's some males that are more successful than others, even though males don't exhibit the behavior as much. So I find that pretty fascinating. It's just that with chimps, you really need a number of years. You need decades to really get at these patterns.
Well, Jill, fascinating to hear more about this work. And this is a really interesting finding. So congratulations on the success. So can you tell us a little bit in that moment when you first saw a chimp using a tool, what was going through your mind?
Actually, I had chatted with one of my project managers who was the very first one to see this behavior. His name is Paco Bertolani. He's gone on to get his PhD. And he asked me what I thought, what these chimps could be after. I said, I'm not sure. And again, we had this one example from Tanzania, and it was a female after a squirrel, which we haven't seen. We've seen them kind of make half-hearted attempts at squirrels. And then Paco saw Tumbo get a bush baby. And so that summer, I was basically sort of just waiting to see the behavior. And sure enough, it was Tumbo was the first one I saw, and I saw her make the tool. And she made the tool, and then she moved some distance with it. And in my mind, I was like, what is Tumbo doing with that tool? But I knew exactly what I hoped she would be doing. So I've seen it over 100 times since then, but it's still exciting, I think, because it is such a novel behavior, and it's more complex, not necessarily the behavior the chimps exhibit, although I do think that's a complex behavior, but just the pattern and why they exhibit this behavior on so many different levels. I think it's interesting why females are hunting. And so I'm very excited. I'm always excited to see youngsters exhibit the behavior, hoping that they'll be successful. Like I said, it takes a while, but it's still exciting. But there's a lot of occurrences like that when I'm in the field that no matter how many times I've seen them, I still get excited to see it again.
Absolutely. Well, this sounds amazing. And it's been great to hear a little bit more about your work and some of these successes that you've had in the field. And I know we've talked a little bit about your life outside of science, and I'm curious about this balance between time in the field and time here in the States. So can you tell us a little bit how you divide your time?
Well, I've been really lucky over the past couple of years. I've been given more time in the field. And I think I mentioned that when I started out, I didn't have that much time in the field. I was lucky enough to get a couple of sabbaticals and one quite early. And Iowa State recognized that I did need to spend time in the field, even though I have someone over there collecting data for me all the time. But these days, I can teach all of my university classes in one semester. And so the rest of the year is essentially free for me to be in the field. I'm usually not there all of that time. I have a lot of grad students, and that's another thing I love to do is to mentor grad students. I always tell them I live vicariously through their projects as well, because they're doing all these exciting things, not just with chimps, but with a number of different primate species. So I come back when they're needing to defend proposals or take preliminary exams or things like that. So I usually make trips of about 3 months at a time, but I really am lucky in that Iowa State lets me spend so much time over there. It is hard to juggle home life, and my dogs are the least of my worries, but it is a worry that I have to find someone to take care of them. Fortunately, my dad in Texas loves to take care of them, but I like to spend time with my family, and all my family are in Texas. My significant other lives in Pennsylvania, so he and I travel distances to see each other. Fortunately, we do spend time in the field together. We both teach in Costa Rica, so we spend at least some weeks at a time together in Costa Rica, which is, of course, wonderful. But one thing that I struggle with is spending enough time with my family and my friends in Texas as well as here in Iowa. It's funny because I do get really melancholy about leaving, and I'm always leaving places. And so it's an interesting life, and I really can't complain. But that's something that I do try to be better at, is to sometimes reduce actually the amount of time that I work and focus on friends and family.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up some of these points. I think these work-life balance questions are on a lot of people's minds these days, particularly young scientists who are interested in going into these professions and kind of wondering, can they juggle it all? Can they balance it all? For me, at least, one of the things that often goes by the wayside as my schedule gets fuller and fuller is reading. And I know you mentioned in the beginning of our interview that you love reading for fun. So Jill, I want to talk books with you. So can you give us a book recommendation of something that you've read and just loved that you think myself and our listeners should check out?
Some of my favorite books are ones I read long ago. One of my very favorite books is called Possession by A.S. Byatt. I love her. And I have to say, I've not seen the movie that was made from that book. And another favorite book of mine is by Larry McMurtry, who's a Texan. It's called Lonesome Dove, which was made into a made-for-TV movie when I was in school. And those are two of my favorite books. I read them years and years and years ago. I've got a lot of favorite books I've read since then. I do tend to focus more on science books these days. But I get a lot of reading done in the field, and I get less reading done when I'm back in the States. I think just because I'm constantly kind of having to do work reading. So I enjoy going to the field because at night, I always read before I go to bed. No matter how tired I am, I have to read in order to go to sleep for some reason. And so, yeah, I keep a list of how many books I read a year. I don't know when I started that, but sometimes it's kind of dismal to look at. And I feel like I really need to be reading more books.
Mine goes up and down. There are years where I read so many books and then years where it's like 2, maybe.
Yes, exactly.
Well, great recommendations. I will put Possession and Lonesome Dove up on our website for our listeners to find. And we've been talking about travel throughout our conversation today. And I know, Jill, you have been to so many phenomenal places as part of your scientific career to work in the field and also to go to conferences. But I want you to pick a favorite today. I'm going to ask you a tough question. Can you tell us about your favorite science travel memory, the place you were at and why it was so memorable?
I would have to say at this moment that one of my very favorite memories was actually from this summer. I was fortunate enough to travel to East Africa, where I did live for 2 years in Kenya. On this particular trip, I was in Uganda and Rwanda, and I'm a speaker for National Geographic expedition tours, so people can basically take vacations, and I'll lecture to them. I get to spend time with them and go to see mountain gorillas and chimpanzees in Uganda and that sort of thing, and I have to say that in Uganda, we stayed at a place called Bwindi Lodge. It was adjacent to the national park, to Bwindi National Park, where we went and saw mountain gorillas, but also mountain gorillas would cross the stream and come onto the lodge grounds. And I was out on a bird walk and saw mountain gorillas, and that was probably one of the most amazing things that happened to me because it wasn't scheduled. And I have to say, I didn't go up and bother them or anything. I was a good primatologist.
Took notes from afar. Yeah.
Yes. That was amazing. That was just got to be one of the top highlights of my life is to be on a bird walk. And I heard a silverback give a vocalization and right away I knew what it was. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just can't believe that just happened. And I started out wanting to study gorillas. And then when I volunteered with chimps, that kind of ruined me for everything else. But I love gorillas. And that was just one of the most amazing experiences. And so I think if anyone ever has a chance to see mountain gorillas, I mean, they really should. And you run into people from all walks of life that are out there to see the mountain gorillas. And I think everybody is just as amazed and awestruck as I am as a primatologist.
Well, this sounds like a phenomenal experience. So how close were you when you sort of realized that they were right there?
When I heard him, I was about 10 meters from him, and that's actually the distance that I keep from chimps, but I moved back.
Yeah.
Gorillas are different from chimps, and I was a strange person there. It's a very small lodge. I'm sure there used to be having people around, but I, of course, didn't want to bother them. And with apes, you definitely have to worry about disease transmission and that sort of thing. But I just stood there for, I think, about an hour, and the rain started, and I just got soaking wet, and I got 2 glimpses of gorillas. A juvenile came out on the path, and he was maybe 20 or 25 meters from me. He just looked at me and went back in, and his mom had done that right before he did. And then you could just hear them eating in there. So it's just amazing that these animals trust people. It's actually a tourist group, and they're usually in the national park. And so they have tourists that come up to them, but it was a great experience.
Well, I love hearing about these experiences from scientists, sort of traveling vicariously through everyone I talk to these marvelous places across the world. So thank you for sharing your experience with us today, Jill. And I want to talk also about some of these opportunities you've had as a scientist to work with amazing people. So we've talked about your field experience over the years, and you've mentioned your field teams and some of the people in your laboratory, some of the mentors you've had. And I think the people you get to work with as a scientist are just incredible. There are so many amazing, funny, brilliant people. And I think scientists don't always get that reputation. So we love breaking the stereotypes of scientists on our show by showcasing some of the fun and funny things that scientists do together. So Jill, can you share with us today a story of your own, of a quirky tradition that you've experienced in the field, or just a funny science memory?
There's so many that are going through my head right now. Well, I guess one thing I was thinking of is things that we do at my site in Senegal. And one of the quirky things we do is that we'll come back from the field and then talk about what the chimps did. But it's really this discussion, and I think almost all primatologists, and I'm sure other people that study animal behavior can identify with this. It's like a soap opera. And so we'll come back and I'll say, my head field assistant, Michelle, will say, oh, did you see everybody today? And tell them who I saw. And then relate something like Luther actually displayed at JUF, and it's like a huge deal because, oh my God, Luther is low ranking. What was he thinking?
Right.
And
how dare he?
Yes, and that sort of thing. And so just sometimes the shock and, well, what did JUF do? I can't believe this, and that sort of thing. And I think it's really interesting. And I tell my students about this because as a scientist, especially that studies ape behavior, we're always cautioned not to be anthropomorphic, which is definitely key. But with apes especially, and I know other animals as well, if you swing too far the other way, you're also going to miss being able to accurately interpret behaviors because we're not the most unique species in the world. We don't have just completely unique behaviors as humans. So I welcome chatting about chimps like this. And for me, especially talking with my Senegalese team members who are not trained like I am, I mean, it provides so much insight, and especially when we share similar interpretations. So it's just kind of this funny tradition that we have. And I know that other scientists have the same tradition, but highlighting that you can do this and still be objective scientists. We're humans, and to try to maintain that we're completely objective as humans is just false because we are human. We have our different biases and different cultural upbringing, among other things. But that's one of the things that we do. But my goodness, if you ever go to a primatology meeting, you'll see some interesting traditions among scientists that maybe I shouldn't talk about here. No. So there's a lot of interesting people, especially in primatology, I think.
Well, now I'm intrigued, Jill. Is there a particular tradition that you can share from one of these meetings that's perhaps family appropriate?
I think that, if anything, we're definitely not pretentious scientists. Field primatologists are not pretentious in the least. And I think at least that most of the people I know are very approachable. I go to a number of different types of meetings, and I won't mention the other ones, but the primatology meetings are very relaxed compared to other types of meetings, so not stuffy. And, of course, good science, but also good fun, and that's where you see your friends and that sort of thing.
Well, I love it, Jill. It sounds like you guys have fun. And I love this idea of kind of recapping the drama of the day around the fire at night. So who gets to name these chimps? I love these names you've been mentioning, Juff, Luther, things like that. So who gets to pick the names?
Well, it's interesting because I do have a pretty strict protocol, actually, as a primatologist in terms of how close we can get and that sort of thing. And over the years, I found we have to make rules, not necessarily for students, but when I have visiting camera crews and things like that, I have pretty strict rules. I also have rules about naming. Just so, for example, we don't name someone after a celebrity that causes us to ascribe the traits of that person onto the chimp. And so,
sure.
For example, one time someone wanted to name the alpha male Saddam, and it was some years ago.
Right.
And I said, no, we're not going to do that.
Let's not go there. Yeah.
So I do try to stay away from naming them after people that we know. And I have had students, so especially during the early years, I asked students if they wanted to name a chimp. And when we were identifying chimps, we had more opportunities. So I've had students name them after family members, but the rest of us don't know them. And so, for example, David, the current alpha male, is named after the father of one of my former students, but we don't know her dad. And we just think of David as David.
Right.
She's since moved on. And we try to also go with Senegalese names. He is coming up with a name that everyone can pronounce.
Ooh.
So some of the names that are common to us may not be easy for my Senegalese field assistants to pronounce, and vice versa. And I myself have picked some pretty long ones that probably should have been shortened. So Dawalema was one I picked because it was a Malinke word, which is a local language, but that was not the easiest to pronounce for students. But we have a real mix. And then lately, what I've been doing, I think it's kind of fun, is my nonprofit has a number of people that donate on a recurring basis. So they give money every month, and they've been doing this for years. And so I asked those people if they wanted to submit baby names, each gave me a male name and a female name. And so what I do is I just keep a list, and then I ask my field assistant to pick out of that list. And so our most recent baby was Arya, which is a character on Game of Thrones. And before that, we had Matilda was another name that was given. And so we have a very interesting mix of names. So some very Senegalese names, like Mamadou is a very common name in Senegal. One of the first chimps that was named was Ross, which is just kind of funny. So we have a real mix of names, but they quickly take on. Diouf, for example, is named after a very famous soccer player and a former president of Senegal, but we all kind of forget that he's just Diouf. He's his own chimp.
Right.
So that's good. That happens. And of course, we don't call them by their names or anything. We don't actually talk at all when we're around the chimps.
Sure. They don't know their names. Yeah.
Right. But if I happen to very rarely be in a situation where, for example, the alpha male likes to display at me maybe once a year just to see if I'm going to move out of his way. And I, of course, can't. But a couple of times he's come close enough that I just sort of am inclined to say something. Instead of saying, hey, I say his name, which, of course, he doesn't know. And it's just kind of this ridiculous sort of thing. But so we've got a very eclectic mix of names at Fongoli.
I like it, Jill. Well, fantastic to hear more about some of these fun traditions that you have. And I love this idea of naming with an eclectic mix of names. And we've talked a little bit about your work and some of the fun things you've been able to do as a scientist over the years. And I want to talk next about some of the things that you haven't yet been able to tackle. So Jill, if we gave you everything today, imagine that funding, staff, technology, feasibility, none of these things were a problem. Is there one question that you have in your mind that you are still just dying to know the answer to?
One of the big questions I have is a scientific question, but it's more of a conservation question, I guess. And that is, how many chimps are there in Senegal? And fortunately, I just had a grant that allowed us to do a survey of chimps in Senegal, but you have to estimate. If we had unlimited sources, then we could spend much more time. We don't want to take a lot of time because there are changes happening in Senegal, like mining pressures, so we need to figure things out quickly. But another thing that we're hoping to do is to do genetic analyses of chimps in Senegal, so we can look to see migration patterns between groups just based on DNA. And fortunately, that's not entirely easy to do, but for us, it's fairly easy to collect samples because you just collect fecal samples and then geneticists can extract DNA from that. But that sort of question, as far as scientific questions at my site go, I think I'd probably shift to a broad question about chimps in Senegal because there are, and not just in Senegal, but there are a number of threats to apes and other animals, of course, as well with the changes that you see today. And so that would probably be what I'd lean towards.
Very interesting. So if you had to estimate just very rough ballpark, even just order of magnitude, how many chimps do you think there are?
Oh, they're probably not more than 1,000.
Okay.
We had estimated between 200 and 500, which was a really giant range years ago, and kind of wondered if there were more, but we didn't even really know about some areas. And with this survey that was recently completed, I think we found some new areas. And of course, the people living around there knew that there were chimps there, but in terms of scientific report, this is a new thing. And my colleague, a Senegalese primatologist, Papa Ibnu Jai, was really the principal investigator of this project on the ground. And so he really traveled all over Senegal and did a survey of the sites that we suspected might have chimpanzees present. And so those are the data right now that we're summarizing. And then from there, hopefully we can go on and do surveys, focus on very promising areas and collect samples for DNA analyses. And then from that, make suggestions as to what conservation action should be done, which I think is pretty vital right now.
Well, Jill, it sounds like you've got the plan all laid out. You're just waiting for the funding to come in.
Yeah, that's always the thing, isn't it?
That's right. Well, wonderful to hear about some of these questions that you would love to see answered in your field. And it's been wonderful to talk to you about this variety of different experiences that you've had throughout your scientific career and in your current position. And we always like to leave our listeners of our show with a little piece of advice, something that will help them along their own journey. So, Jill, can you share with us today a piece of advice that you received at some point in your career that was really helpful that you would like to pass forward?
Follow your passion, even if it seems like it's going to be impossible. Persevere also. And one kind of funny bit of information, but that was very helpful that my undergraduate advisor gave me when I went to graduate school, is that he told me that everyone's going to seem like they're smarter than you and they're not. And so that was really something that helped me. Probably knew my insecurity in going to a big graduate program and that sort of thing. But so kind of funny, I look back on that, but it helped me a lot.
Well, I think that is fantastic advice. And I think that insecurity, that sort of little voice in the back of your head, never really goes away. I think even as a faculty member, that's something that I'm struggling with. I know some of my peers are struggling with as well. So great advice.
Right. It pops back up. I mean, you can get it under control and work on it. I think it's just a process.
Definitely. Is there any other last piece of advice, Jill, or any last note of inspiration that you would like to end our conversation on today?
I just think that people should do what they want to do. I know that people talk about making smart decisions, and maybe I didn't make decisions that were always smart at the time, but I feel like things worked out. And I feel like if young people want to do something, they should try and do it and contact people and just go for it.
I like it. Live fearlessly, listeners. Well, Jill, can you tell our listeners now how they can reach out if they want to learn more about you and what you're doing?
I have a blog that I don't update frequently, but it does have information and different links you can click and that sort of thing. It's savannahchimp.blogspot.com. But really, my email is harder to get to when I'm in the field in Senegal. The connection is not as quick. And so I communicate with my students via Facebook, and I'm happy to accept friendship on Facebook, Twitter as well. I tend to get a lot of emails, and so people's messages get kind of buried in my emails. But also my email at Iowa State is just my last name, which is Pruetz@iastate.edu.
Perfect. Well, Jill, thank you so much for sharing those resources with us today. Listeners, definitely get in touch if you have any questions. And Jill, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your own story.
Well, thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure, Jill. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.